Welcome to Feminism Today, everyone. I'm Sophia Johnson in New York. More than 2 months after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, more than 20 million women have lost access to nearly all elective abortions in their home states. And a slate of strict new trigger laws expected to take effect will soon shut out even more. Texas, Tennessee, and Idaho all have existing restrictions on abortion, but new laws will either outlaw the procedure entirely or heighten penalties for doctors who perform an abortion, contributing to a seismic shift in who can access abortion in their home states. For more on this, we're joined by Alexis McGill-Johnson, the president and CEO of Planned Parenthood Federation of America. Alexis McGill-Johnson, welcome to Feminism Today.
Thank you so much for having me, Sophia. I'm glad to be here.
Now, first of all, I have to say thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to speak to us and sort of help us to understand what the issues and the challenges that are at stake right now. More and more states are obviously banning most abortions, prohibiting the procedure with narrow exceptions from time of conception or after fetal cardiac activity has been sensed. What does this tell us about the status of women's rights in this country?
Look, I mean, as you noted, we are 2 months past Roe being overturned. Nearly a third of all U.S. states have abortion bans in effect. It means 1 in 3 American women have already lost access to the right to control their own bodies in our states. And, you know, the laws are incredibly extreme, right? Some are banning access to abortion at conception. Other laws are being introduced around the right to travel out of state to get the care, or the right to get the information that you need to travel out of state to get care. Mm-hmm. And what that means, you know, is exactly what we anticipated and what we have been seeing. You know, there's chaos, there's confusion, there's devastation, you know, and clearly all of it is predicated on the fact that we are not to be trusted to be making our own decisions about our own bodies. And that is threatening to create a tremendous public health crisis.
Can we talk a little bit about the chilling effect this is really having also on advocates and doctors in favor of abortion rights with the fear of the newest trigger laws? How is Planned Parenthood, for example, responding to the needs of patients who either need an abortion or because they're facing life-threatening complications or trying to travel to get elsewhere?
You know, look, our job will continue to center the patients and to ensure that they are getting care that they need and getting to the care that they need. And so Planned Parenthood, along with other independent providers, our local affiliates, abortion funds, continue to work to make sure that that patients can get the care that they need. We have a website collectively called abortionfinder.org that is run by Power to Decide, that is creating the platform and the space for people to get the information that they need. But the chilling effect is real, right? We see that there are providers who are afraid to treat patients who say are in emergency situations or having miscarriages because they are afraid that they will be criminalized and prosecuted for providing that care. We've seen instances where hospitals, insurers and administrators have not allowed providers to move forward with terminations, even in the cases where there was an intended pregnancy that is no longer viable, which is, you know, eminently threatening the life of the mother, and in some cases ushering in sepsis. These are the kinds of things that I think really certainly not intended consequences, but all too well forecasted consequences of what some of these bans, you know, would be ushering in. And I think the medical journals have been clear. Their concern about Roe being overturned would mean that people could die because of the impact on destroying the trust and the relationship for patients who need to get access to care and providers who are unable to provide it.
Can we talk a little bit about the national trends? The states that bar abortion from conception tend to be located in the South and the Midwest, including Alabama, Arkansas, Kentucky, Missouri, and Oklahoma. Um, First, I can't even imagine what your legal team's going through trying to navigate all these varying laws and variegated responses to the Supreme Court ruling. But importantly, what's happening in states where abortion is restricted? How is Planned Parenthood really managing and navigating this legal space?
Everywhere where there are bans, we are suing along with our partners at the ACLU and the Center for
Mhm.
Reproductive Rights. We are making sure that even in the cases where we're able to get injunctions, meaning that the law doesn't go into effect immediately, that is an opportunity to extend access to immediate care that people need now. And so we continue to fight on the legislative side, and then also, of course, our political and advocacy organizations are fighting electorally to make sure that all of those folks who have ushered in these incredibly egregious extreme bans are being held to account for the kind of chaos and crisis that they have created.
I want to talk about the politics at play here. For decades, Democrats have said they didn't need to codify abortion rights into law because we had Roe v. Wade to stand on. And now that's sort of been obliterated. Were these Supreme Court decisions ever really enough?
I think you're right. I think that for years, I think many of us took for granted the fact that the courts were our backstop. That particularly the Supreme Court, the constitutional right to abortion had been codified under Roe and Casey, and that meant that federal legislation was not a priority. And yet, at the same time, for the last decade and a half or so, we have been screaming at Planned Parenthood and other organizations to say, something is happening with these laws, these targeted regulations against abortion providers that we saw, chipping away at the right slowly over the last decade and a half. Something was happening in places where, even though the public opinion in a state was high in support of accessing abortion or keeping abortion legal in that state, there was still a small group of lawmakers that were able to pass these kinds of regulations without any penalty or any accountability. And so I think that we have been saying that this is going to happen, certainly in the last administration. The remaking of the federal judiciary, including the Supreme Court, has meant that it set the stage for the ultimate overturn of Roe. But I think we have to be realistic. I mean, we have to look back and say Roe was being overturned long before it actually got overturned, and the impact, I think, has been tremendously unconscionable. You mentioned, just the state of healthcare in many of the states in the South and the Midwest. Many of the states that have the most egregious abortion bans are also the same states that have the highest maternal mortality rates. They're the states that haven't expanded access to Medicaid or healthcare. Many of them are the highest infant mortality and the lowest with regards to well-being of children. So I think that the erosion of these rights and the erosion of the kind of care and well-being for the citizens in these states, I think, has been a long time coming. And this overturning of Roe, this Dobbs decision, is going to further exacerbate the circumstances that many residents find themselves in these states.
Extending this thought just a little bit, where are we with the Women's Health Protection Act?
So the Women's Health Protection Act has passed the House. The Senate voted on it twice. And we got everybody on record as to where they would be with respect to, creating federal legislation that would help codify Roe. The reality is we didn't have 52 senators. And that is our goal this election cycle. For the Action Fund, our goal is to get to 52 and to make sure that we are preserving and bringing in enough governors with a strong reproductive health record in order to be the backstop in each state now that Roe has been overturned and we are fighting state by state.
Something I've discussed extensively with guests, on this show is really how reproductive choice has been sort of a withering away of our rights, as you mentioned in when we started this conversation. Um, I wonder if we could talk a little bit about how much worse motherhood penalty is going to get if we cannot stop sort of the train from running wild at this point.
Look, the reality is that with this law being overturned, what has happened is instead of our abortion rights being codified in the Constitution, our inequality has been codified. And as we see the further erosion of these rights state by state, and not just the criminalization of abortion, as you know, Sophia, they've also introduced bills to criminalize IUDs and IVF, and, emergency contraception. We know that we heard in Justice Thomas's opinion an appetite for coming after, trans rights and marriage equality. They're all linked into what we have had known as the right to privacy. And I think that's really important here because Roe was never grounded in equality, right? Wasn't never grounded in, that's how we, interpret it. That's how, we understand it. But the reality is the Roe and Casey were really more about burden and gestation and privacy than they were about equality. Yeah. And so I think in this moment, our job has to be to reimagine what a real equality act would look like, right? What would it really look like to build a more inclusive set of rights that include not just the right to protect access to abortion, but also trans rights, workers' rights, accessibility rights, all the things that we need in order to live free lives, live with dignity, and live with pride. And I think that those are the things that we are now, perhaps free to consider in a different way now that Roe has been overturned.
Yeah. Now, one of the things I think many people don't think about or speak to, get a lot of coverage, is this idea that, or the fact that Planned Parenthood has a global reach in delivering vital reproductive health care, sex education, information to millions of people worldwide. First, how is the Supreme Court ruling playing out in the countries where you operate around the world? We talked a little bit about the Canada effect. But second, at the heart of this, the mission is reproductive rights. Can we talk about sort of what that means and what that is and what that should look like?
Yeah, I mean, so Planned Parenthood Global operates, extraordinary programs both in the continent of Africa and in Latin America. And we've seen so much of what our partners have done over the last decade become the reality of how we now need to operate, right? What does it mean to educate in a essentially repressive regime? What does it mean to be able to help people get care that they need and to really empower and engage the local communities to take charge of their own destiny and their agency? We've also seen extraordinary movement in countries like Argentina and Mexico and Ireland over the last couple of years that I think have also given us a playbook, right? As movement people. On what does it mean to actually to shift a conversation, sustain movement work, to really bring in key critical advocates like journalists and corporations and university students in ways that I think this movement needs in the U.S. needs to be invigorated with.
Mm-hmm. Can we talk a little bit about access to reproductive care, just generally, lack of access, but also probably what might be emerging, some of the data shows that there's some backlog in OBGYN care, certainly because of the pandemic. But how is Planned Parenthood responding to this sort of added layer of pressure?
Well, look, from an abortion care perspective, as I mentioned earlier, the abortion care infrastructure has been, challenged, particularly over the last 15 years, with the number of laws and regulations that have really impacted the ability of providers to provide the care that they can deliver. And I think what has happened with this decision coming down is now we have clinics in states that are seeing an incredible surge from people who are in states where they can no longer get access to care. That is in itself displacing the very people from those states who now have to move to other states to get care. And so you see a ripple effect. We're seeing patients from Texas all over this country. I was just with talking to one of my CEO colleagues in the state of Washington who said he was Texas patients regularly. So we have to understand that as an impact on the care broadly, obviously, in terms of just being able to get appointments and having to shift an infrastructure to support that. We've also seen a number of our health centers and CEOs doubling down on what they need to with respect to birth control, with respect to education in a moment where people are desperate for information and support in order to help them manage through this crisis as well.
Reproductive health disparities in the United States. According to the CDC, Black and Hispanic women have the highest abortion rates. First, is this true? Do you have any data? Would you release the data? And second, why do abortion restrictions, or can you give us some insights into why abortion restrictions disproportionately impact people of color?
Well, look, I mean, people of color live at the, many of us live at the margins of lots of infrastructure in society, right? And so the fact that we're at the margins of the healthcare disparity is not surprising when only we looked at the last couple of years of COVID to recognize the impact of what it has meant to essentially be frontline workers in this society and yet be denied the ability to control our own bodies. So yes, the reality is that these bans disproportionately impact Black and brown women, Latino, Indigenous people of color. They disproportionately impact low income and rural communities, LGBTQ communities. And, again, the same states that are creating these most extreme, egregious bans are also the same ones with the most horrific maternal mortality and other disparities. And I think that is what we need to be looking at and recognizing the impact there.
I wonder if we could spend some time talking a little bit about what this means for, or potentially could mean for, people who are trying to get pregnant, people who have life-threatening issues while they're pregnant, ectopic pregnancies, for example, but also non-viable pregnancies. What does this mean, and how does Planned Parenthood respond to these types of situations?
Well, when SB 8, the Texas law that had the bounty hunting provision, went into effect, the first time I actually heard of impact on a patient with one with an ectopic pregnancy and one with a pregnancy that was no longer viable came out of this period, in the sense that the providers, to the chilling effect you talked about earlier, were afraid to treat the patient for fear that doing so would incur essentially a bounty hunting fee of no less than $10,000, but that person could be sued by any number of people in any number of states, which meant that the risk of providing care was really, quite frankly, unknowable. Now that risk is criminal in some of these states, right? It's become a felony to provide the care, even in the, some of these bans don't include any exceptions, including the life of the mother. And I think that we have seen health providers and hospitals legitimately struggle with what it means to provide this care. When you have a state like Texas, essentially tell the Department of Health and Human Services that their guidance around emergency medical provision did not supersede the state guidance. That is essentially, again, not centering what a patient might need in that moment. It is threatening the lives of patients, and also, making clear that they're willing to double down on the impact that something like, having sepsis would mean, that could risk a patient's life within, 30 minutes or so, rather than submit to being governed by the federal government. And I think it's just atrocious. I mean, I think, we are, looking at a party that has claimed itself to be, quote unquote, pro-life, and yet in these instances are willing to stand by and not actually address some of the real immediate challenges that come with this kind of medical provision or lack of provision.
Right. What would you like anti-abortion advocates to know about the work of Planned Parenthood?
I think that, look, I think we trust people to make decisions about their own bodies. I think first and foremost, we are here to help support their agency in making decisions, private medical decisions about their own healthcare. And everyone we talk to is clear that they came to their decisions with their partners or themselves or their pastor by themselves. They didn't need the help of a politician to engage in the conversation. And they very much resent the power and control that's being exerted over their own bodies in this moment. They should know that we are there with patients, not just when they come in through, our front doors for access to birth control or STI testing or breast cancer screenings or gender affirming care, that we stand with them at the intersection of so many rights that are being eroded right now, in the, world of criminal justice, immigration reform, and, watching their voting rights be stripped away, and that we see them holistically and intersectionally across these issues, because we know that the impact on a variety of circumstances is going to affect them as much as just being able to decide, if and when they would become pregnant. And so I think, I think what the other side rightfully does is fear us, if I can be so bold, because they know that, when you are able to create a community of people who believe in their own agency and believe in their own freedom, that they will defend and fight for that freedom. And I think that's what we have seen. We saw it in Kansas. We're going to see it, I think, throughout this fall. People who are showing up and holding people accountable to the kind of world that they want to live in.
When did you know or realize you wanted to become a reproductive health activist and an advocate for women's healthcare services? How did you know this was your calling?
I mean, honestly, Sophia, I grew up as a race woman. I grew up kind of at the intersection of race and gender before there was a name for it, before intersectionality exists, or at least that my mom didn't have the language. I grew up as a womanist, not as a feminist, as Alice Walker might say, and or Toni Morrison, right? I think that for me, it wasn't until I was, well into my 30s, and I saw a billboard in New York at Soho that was so explicitly demonizing Black women for their reproductive choices that I got off the bench and into the fight. I thought that the court was our backstop too. I was born in 1972. This fight had happened. It was settled. And that we had to make meaning of it and had to make sure that it became a reality, but not to this extent. And I think, look, the moment that we're in right now, one where we have, where we are no longer essentially defending Roe and we have the opportunity to reimagine, I think is actually an incredibly important moment, particularly as women of color, to center the experiences of the folks who are being most impacted so that we can build a right that is actually truly inclusive.
Yeah. You wrote the foreword to Reverend Katie Zay's new book, A Complicated Choice. And I'm curious, really. I mean, I've got so many thoughts about the type of advocacy you do in different spaces. But why did you think it was important to support the book's central thesis?
I think that it was really about trying to kind of blend so much of the work that I have done around how our brains process complicated issues and challenges and choices and bias, and the way in which stigma shows up in abortion stories writ large. And as Katie was writing that story at the beginning of COVID, and when I had the opportunity to sit with her, talk to her, and read the accounts, it just occurred to me how connected, and how important as as people of faith. And I talk about being late to faith on my own journey, recognizing just the intersection of what that actual kind of redemption means for people.
Earlier this year, you published an article in Elle magazine titled "We've Never Felt Ruth Bader Ginsburg's Absent More." What should advocacy and activism look like? What's next on the agenda for abortion rights in America, you think?
RBG, so many other activists before her, sitting in all different places from the Supreme Court to the local community center, I think have a central set of values in common. And I think first and foremost, they are unapologetic. They're unapologetic about who they are. They're unapologetic about their deep desire to be free. They're unapologetic about, what it means to fight in this moment, not just for themselves, but for future generations. And I think that the people who you will see leading this work and leading this movement over the next 50 years are going to be people who continue to embody that spirit, who continue to embody that sense of fear, of fearlessness, right, and fierceness, that allow them the courage. And allow them to use that courage, make it contagious, so that they can bring other people on in the journey. It's very easy to be demoralized right now. It's very easy to be bereft of hope. And I think our job right now, particularly as leaders in this space, in this movement, is to bring people back into history, to tell them this is not the first time rights have been taken away, to give them a pathway forward and let them know that as long as they use their voice and their bodies to demonstrate how they truly feel, this kind of fascism won't win. And I think that's where we are right now.
Alexis McGill-Johnson, President and CEO of Planned Parenthood and author of numerous articles. Thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thank you for having me, Sophia.
And that's it for our program today. Remember, you can follow me or the show on Instagram and Twitter. Thank you so much for watching Feminism Today on Free Speech TV. Join us again next week.